Hi there. Welcome back to Witchcraft Fundamentals. This is Lesson 4, Correspondence and Components 1, Traditional Correspondence. Correspondence. Why do we care about correspondence? What is correspondence? Well, in short, everything in the world has an energy. That's part of the fundamental belief of witchcraft and magic. Everything has an energy. A book has an energy. Tea has an energy. Trees have an energy. People have energies. Animals have energies. And all of those energies have a resonance. Think of it as a flavor. Some of those resonances are complementary to others and some are not. So when we are doing magic, we need to know what something's correspondence is before we can decide whether it should be part of a working. So if we're going to, say, do a working for courage, we say we want to do a candle spell, and we'll talk more about that in a couple lessons. You want to do a candle spell for courage. You're going to get a candle that is in the correct shape that corresponds to courage, a color that corresponds to courage. You might dress it with an oil that corresponds to courage. You might have a piece of music or a chant that resonates with the idea of courage for you. All of these things work together to create your magical working. Well, in order to do that, you need to know about correspondence. That's kind of how all of this works. So, how do we know what is something that corresponds with courage? Well, in traditional correspondence, you look it up in a book or on a website. There are thousands of tables of correspondences out there available to you in various and sundry places, and they're all a little bit different. So when I talk about traditional correspondence, I'm talking about, for the most part, Western European magical correspondences, because that's what we tend to use here in the United States. We do have some that have been refined and evolved a little bit here in the States, but for the most part, we're really looking back to the traditional European way of doing things. That can differ, of course, depending on your community and your tradition. A lot of specific traditions or magical paths have their own unique set of correspondences, as do various cultures around the world. So something that is a Wiccan correspondence might be different than a Druidic correspondence, that could be very different than a Chinese traditional correspondence or an indigenous correspondence. It gets kind of tricky the more you go into it. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. But as a new practitioner, what you want to do is kind of settle on a specific path or tradition that you want to start with looking at correspondences. If you try to do everything all at once, you'll drive yourself completely insane. For most folks, that's going to be traditional Western magic and occultism. That's what you're going to find in most witchcraft, in most Wicca, all your basic kind of British, Western European stuff. Things that you're going to find in the classic, like, Llewellyn style books. Your Scott Cunninghams, your Raymond Bucklands, all of your kind of spell cookbooks are going to have, you know, for the most part, the same basic correspondences. And that's the easiest place to start for most people. There's a website called Wikipedia, as of 2021, that is actually pretty decent. It's got correspondence tables and timings and all of that kind of stuff. And what you usually find in the books are big old kind of spreadsheet-like tables. You know, the red, blue, green, and all of the different things that are associated with those colors. Then it's got, you know, different plants and what they're corresponding to, different stones and what they correspond to. That's the easiest place to start for a lot of those things. But it can get about as complicated as you can possibly imagine once you get into multiple cultures, multiple traditions, different interpretations. And we'll talk a lot more about that in a bit. But so the basics. Everything has a correspondence. You're not going to instantly learn all the correspondences for everything. We don't learn like that. So I have some recommendations for how to start looking at correspondences. So the first thing that is easiest for most sighted people is starting with color. The basic kind of preschool colors, red, green, blue, yellow, pink, brown colors. All of those have specific correspondences in various traditions. In kind of the bog standard Western European and in the United States magic is going to be red is usually passion and will and aggression. Pink is usually love and comfort and romance. Orange is often business and courage and acumen. Green can be a couple of different things depending on who you are. It's often money. It's often, growth for like plants, that sort of thing. It can be grounding. Blue is usually healing. The idea that it is associated with the ocean, and of course the waters are associated with healing. We'll talk about elements in a moment. So blue is normally healing. It can also be travel. It can be communication. Kind of depends on who you ask. Purple is almost always the color of magic itself. I know obviously it's the traditional color of royalty in Europe. So it's the idea of sovereignty and kind of ruling leadership. Yellow is often associated with air, and that's associated with communication and intellect, poetry, inspiration. Brown is almost always kind of grounding, earth, calm kind of things. Gray can be a lot of different things. It's usually about transitions or kind of things that are in between one thing or the other. Black is often banishing, absorbing of negativity, protection. White is generally considered the catch-all color because white light, of course, it contains the spectrum of all of the other colors. So it's kind of for anything, it's your all-purpose color. It's if you can only have one candle, make sure it's white. The next thing is elements, which I already referenced a little bit. Shows you just how important they are. In Western magic, we tend to have the 4 elements, which is earth, air, fire, and water. And depending on where you're from, they can be slightly different things. I personally like the addition of having the center, and then as well as above and below, but that's not every tradition. What those things mean, in the traditions that I learned in, earth is in the north, and it's growth and stability and age and rest. It's often also considered the realm of the dead. In other traditions, the west is the realm of the dead. The east can be either air or fire, depending on your tradition. I personally have air in the east because here in Washington State, all of the wind farms are in eastern Washington. So I think of wind as being in the east. We'll talk more about personalizing correspondences in the next lesson. And yeah, so air is that intellect and wisdom and communication. The south is fire because, the south is where the heat is if you're in North America. But in some traditions, like I said, fire can be in the east and air can be in the south. It kind of depends on where you are and what you're doing. One is not right or wrong compared to the other. It's just tradition, and I highly recommend just picking one set of dispositions and just going with it. That brings us to water in the west. Water is, it's healing, it's movement, it's flow, it's evolution, it's erosion, weathering. Depending on your tradition, sometimes, like I said, sometimes the underworld is in the west. That comes out of Irish mythology, I believe. kind of depends. Like indigenous North Americans generally have the dead and the underworld in the north. The center is the realm of spirit, often the personal center, talking about that grounding and centering that we talked about in previous lessons. The center. Above and below, that's usually the overworld and the underworld, which I talked about briefly in the very first lesson. But really, it's just the idea of being truly connected on all sides to all things. So yeah, that's elements and directions there. From there, there's herbs. Herbs is a really tricky one because there's medicinal correspondences for herbs, there's magical correspondences for herbs, and they're different depending on where you are. How can this be? It's a plant, it has the same chemical compounds. Well, yes, but traditional Chinese medicine and Western medicine don't agree on things. If you ask indigenous and shamanic traditions about their medicine, they're going to give you very different correspondences to things. An excellent example is the plant mugwort. Mugwort is used as a very magical, psychic enhancing herb in Western Europe. It's used as a banishing, cleansing herb in Chinese medicine. Very different purposes, same plant. I really, really recommend getting a book or 3 on herbal correspondences. I'm a big fan of having a medicinal, kind of scientific, here are the chemical compounds and scientific Latin names of the plants, and some magical resources as separate resources. I'm a big fan of the Scott Cunningham Encyclopedia of Magical Herbs, and there's also a book called Los Remedios, which is the herbs in the curanderismo tradition, which has a lot of the same plants, things like basil, lemon balm, mint. They're used differently in the different traditions. It can be really informative to look at multiple traditions, particularly if you're in the process of forming your own kind of personal list of correspondences, which we'll talk more about next lesson. So yeah, herbs are a huge, exhaustive subject. You can get multiple advanced degrees in herbalism because it's complicated. It's also a place where if you don't do your homework, you can die. Do not consume plants unless you are 100% what they are, how they're going to interact with anything else you're consuming, and whether or not they're poisonous. That's your PSA of the day. Don't die out of stupidity. Yes. Stones. Stones are wonderful things. Pagans love our shiny rocks, for the most part. We really do. I've got a big bowl right over there filled with beautifully colorful shiny rocks. Carnelians, bloodstone, moonstone, jet, hematite, labradorite, that's my personal favorite. Stones all have their own unique correspondence, and crystals in particular have very strong resonance. So a lot of your kind of traditional magical jewelry are going to be made out of semi-precious stones that are going to have a magical correspondence, and they're then worn for the purposes of that resonance. When I was in law school, I wore Lapis Lazuli for all of my exams because it is kind of corresponds with kind of the law and justice. And so I used that to kind of align myself to what I was studying and try to do better on my exams. To mixed results. But I passed. A great resource for that is the Crystal Bible by Judy Hall. It is not exhaustive. No one book is ever going to be exhaustive. And sometimes you're going to be going through these things and you're going to see giant lists of like 50 correspondences for like one stone. And you're going to like, that can't mean all of those things. We will talk more about that a little bit when we talk about things in the next lesson for personal correspondences. But yeah, things like lavender, things like quartz. Quartz is the white candle of the crystal world. You can use it as a kind of enhancer for literally anything, because quartz just holds energy. So yeah, stones are great. You can do all kinds of fun things with them, and we will talk more about working with stones and crystals when we get to the spellcrafting lessons. Incenses and oils. These are actually one of my absolute favorite things to work with. Scent is one of the strongest activators of the memory in the brain, and so I find working with scent very, very evocative and tends to align my energies very, very easily and naturally, and it doesn't feel like I have to try too hard, so I love them. Different incenses and oils and blends can have very, very different correspondences. You know, a straight kind of oil or incense where it's like pine resin. That's just literally it's sap from pine trees that is dried out a little bit and let it smolder on a charcoal. That's just your correspondence for the plant, pine. Pretty straightforward. Then you've got incenses and oils that are blends of multiple things. Something like a traditional formula, like you go into any pagan shop and you can pick up protection incense, and you'll look down the ingredients and be like frankincense and myrrh and dragon's blood and cascarilla powder and bay or whatever. All of those different components have their own correspondence. And to really know what you're dealing with in there, you've got to look up the correspondence of all of those different ingredients to see how they mesh together. You know, maybe one is straight protection, another is something to amplify protection, maybe another is to create barriers, maybe another is to banish negativity. You know, there's all kinds of different ways of layering your correspondences to get the kind of final intention that you want with something. So I'm a big fan of those. The Encyclopedia of 5,000 Spells by Judica Ills. Might have mispronounced that, sorry. That's a great source with a bunch of different formulas for incenses and oils that have very clear kind of purposes. Do definitely recommend that one. It's also just a great book to have. All of the spells in that book are taken out of their cultural context. To truly understand how those spells work, you need to understand where they fit into their own traditions. That is your cultural appropriation disclaimer for the day. Last thing in kind of the basics is planetary magic. Now, planetary magic is a whole astrological wormhole that is really cool. There's a wonderful book called Secrets of Planetary Magic by Christopher Warnock. Great book. If it resonates with you, go for it. It can be a real deep dive. I am not an astrology person. It does not... I'm a earth person. I talk to plants and trees and animals. I don't really do the stars. Not because there's anything wrong with it. It's just not my personal resonance. I would rather go to someone whose resonance is with the stars and have them tell me, be the translator for that kind of stuff, because it just, I don't know it very well. It doesn't jam. But if that is something you like, that's a great resource. And I will have all of these recommended books in the description down below, so you can go to your local occult bookstore and support them. Yeah. So those are the very basic things. Colors, elements, directions, herbs, stones, incenses, and planets. With that, then you get into things like timing. Timing is one of those areas where people have very strong thoughts and opinions about timing. Some people, it is, you must do something within like a 20-minute, like they've got like calculators on their phones with like exact movement of the stars and planets and things, and you must do it at the exact time. That's cool. That works for you. I don't do it that way, like at all. The most important things to think about when you're looking at timing, I tend to go with kind of the macro timing, like the time of year, the season. I will look at moon phases. I will sometimes look at days of the week if I'm doing something that I'm trying to be more precise about. But all of these things are kind of nice to haves. So time of year and season, that's your biggest one. You know, the summer is about growth and heat and warmth and production, and because, you know, the flowers are blooming, the animals are procreating, people are procreating, pollen is everywhere. I'm sneezing a lot. The fall is about winding things down, harvesting, the loss of potency, you know, as things go in towards winter, where it is slumber and decay and a bit of death. Spring, where things reawaken and new beginnings and all those beautiful things. Those are larger energy currents that can affect the workings you do. So, say it's the springtime, and I want to get a new job. Great! Springtime is full of new beginnings energy, and I can just do all my workings for new beginnings, new beginnings, new beginnings, new beginnings. Well, what if I need to bind and banish something in the spring or the height of summer, where the energy is all positive and growth and woo? Well, maybe instead of doing a banishing and binding, which is naturally associated with like fall and winter, instead you would do growth of new potential, moving on from negative situations, or you just do it anyway. It will be a little bit more challenging. The natural currents of energy around you won't be quite as in line with yours. So you might have to work a little harder, put a couple extra layers of correspondence, put a little extra energy into your working if it's not in tune with the natural energy currents. That's why there's all these other things and not just the season. And obviously the season depends on which hemisphere you're in. Maybe you're near the equator or the Arctic Circle, where you don't so much have seasons as you have cold and dark, or light and cold, or hot and wet versus dry and hot. You kind of have to adapt these things to where you are and what's going on. And as you begin to pay attention to these things and start actually practicing magic, doing energy work, you'll start to intuit and feel what the energy is actually like where you are, so that at any given time you might get the, oh, you know, all the book correspondence is saying this is the perfect time to do this working, but something in the back of your brain or tugging at the base of your spine is going to be like, wait a week. Just wait a week. If that happens, I highly recommend you listen to that intuition. Or if you're not sure, do some divination to see what that little tug is trying to tell you. Your personal feelings about these things are much, much more important than any book definition. So, moon phases. Moon phases are something that I do pay a fair amount of attention to, in so much that there's, you know, the full moon, the waning moon, the new moon, the waxing moon. And it's a lovely cycle of, you know, growing and diminishing and growing and diminishing. And that energy can be very easily and effectively tapped into in spell work. When the moon is new, traditionally we do workings for new beginnings, banishing things that no longer serve us, binding things that harm us, ending cycles and habits, getting a fresh, clean start for some new endeavor. The waxing moon is about growth. You know, it's all about taking something and amplifying it and letting it mature and making it stronger. Full moon, that's your big potent time. Now the thing about moon phases is the NASA moon calculator be like, and the full moon shall be at its zenith at, 4:37 a.m. Greenwich Mean Time. A thanks to Google, I can find out when that is in my local time. But that might be the middle of the night, or the middle of the workday, or some other highly inconvenient time. That's okay. Don't stress it. When we're talking about magic, the full moon or the new moon is usually the day before, the day of, and the day after. So it's actually, you have like a 3-day window to do your full moon or new moon kind of workings. In a lot of Latin American traditions, we'll do things like novenas, 9-day spells. And if we do a novena on the full moon, that might be the 3 days before, and then that 3-day kind of day before, day of, day after, and then the 3 days after that. Big thing. Or if it's all about build up, we might do like a whole, like, the 9 days leading up to the full moon is like a big thing on the day of. You know, it doesn't have to be super, super precise, unless, you know, your gods tell you you must do it at this absolute exact time. Then maybe consider taking the day off and doing that exact thing that they want you to do. It's up to you. So that's the moon. Days of the week. Days of the week are also one of those tricky ones because in English, the days of the week are a combination of Norse gods and Greek gods. You know, like Tuesday is Tyr's Day, Friday is Frigga's Day. And they kind of correspond with some Roman gods a little bit, like Saturn is Saturday and Sol is Sunday, because sun. I actually find it easier in Spanish where it's just the Roman gods, you know, you got lunes, martes, miércoles is Mercury, moon, and very easy. But depending on what language you speak, the days of the week can be named for different gods or solar bodies or, you know, planets, and that changes what correspondence you're going to work with for that day of the week. What rocks with me is, you know, the way it's named in Spanish. Those are the gods that work for me for the day's correspondences. So I have Monday is Moon Day, Martes is Mars for Tuesday, which corresponds with Tyr. Miércoles is Mercury, Wednesday. Jueves, Thursday, that's kind of the Zeusy guy, thunder and lightning. Venus, Vieneth, Friday. So, yeah, I'm multicultural. It's weird. But yeah, so those are the days of the week that I use. Saturn, sábado for Saturday, and Sol, Sunday, day of the sun. So depending on what language you speak natively, what mythologies you like, your different days of the week might have correspondences right there in the name. Or you might have a tradition that has very specific energies they assign to different days of the week. Go with it. If you want to start getting real nitpicky, if you get into things like ceremonial magic and a lot of astrological correspondences, you'll get down to like having each hour has like an ascendant planetary body or star or whatever. I don't really know astrology, so I apologize if you're super into that. I don't know it, so I can't teach it to you. I found there's a couple like apps on my phone that tell me what like the different planetary hours are, so I can just check. You know, why do you care? So if you're doing like the spell to get to like ace your interview for your dream job, well, that's a pretty big deal. You want to give that spell every possible chance you can for it to help you. So you're going to have the correct color correspondences, the correct plants, the correct incense, the correct music, the correct, you know, elemental helpers, the correct deities and spirits, and you're going to do the phase of the moon, the day of the week. You might go as far as the hour to the minute to make it as potent as you possibly can, because it's super important to you. And if you have the time, you have the energy, why not give it everything you've got? That doesn't mean you have to. The number of spells I have done while literally walking down the sidewalk and just going, done. Doesn't have to be a great big deal. We'll talk about spellcrafting intensively in a couple of lessons. But that's why we care about all these correspondences. And it can be as kind of big, broad, conceptual to as nitpicky detailed as you feel like you need it to go. The nice thing about working with correspondences is most of this stuff is very concrete. You know, magic is a very ephemeral thing. It's thought and energy and intention and will, and that's very nebulous stuff. Incense, you will learn to feel those energies. They're pretty strong. Things where it's a little bit, weaker energies, more subtle energies, you may or may not ever really be able to perceive. Like, I can tell when it's kind of the full moon and kind of tell when it's the new moon, but I couldn't tell you if I'm in a waning crescent or, 2 days from full. I don't, I'm not that into it, sorry. So you can really take it as far as you feel is appropriate at any given time. So another word about conflicting correspondence. So I mentioned earlier, different cultures have different correspondence. This can be very tricky for people that need to feel like they are correct. Because if there's 5 correct answers and each one says that they are the exclusive and sole answer, what do you do? Basil in European correspondence, Indigenous North American correspondence, Chinese correspondence, Central and South American correspondence, the Indian subcontinents, their correspondence. This herb, one herb, is in all of them and means different things to each of those cultures. That does not mean that one is right and the other is wrong. We're going to talk a lot about personal correspondences in the next lesson. But the main idea is different cultures have different contexts for interacting with things, and so they have different associations with them. The whole development of the correspondences that we know today that have become our kind of pagan standard correspondences came from somewhere. And they generally came from people of limited means who were working the land, had certain plants, stones, things around them that were accessible to them, and they told stories. And those stories over time became myth, and they developed a resonance and an energy, and it became a thing. That's how correspondences evolve. Things like, we might talk about pop culture magic when we get into like spellcrafting. But symbols can evolve and develop a resonance. Like the Captain America shield is an amazing protective sigil, because whole continents of people see that symbol and immediately have an energetic association with it. That's how these things all came about. So when you're looking at your correspondence and one book says that basil is for healing and another one says it's for banishing demons, and they probably do. Garlic is a great example of that. Garlic is good for everything, as is lavender. But different folks have different interactions with things. There are different cultural contexts for things. I suggest either stick to the correspondences that are from the culture you live in, or if you have a specific tradition or culture that, as you're going researching things, has a really strong resonance with you, like something where you're reading and think, oh yeah, that's totally what I feel is right for that thing. Maybe that's a hint that you should study that tradition. See if the rest of those things work for you. Or if something, one-off thing from, say, Chinese medicine like super resonates with you but nothing else does, what is it about that one thing? That might tell you something about the type of magic that is the most natural for you, that is most likely to be your deep dive, the thing that you're going to be really good at. Everyone has different strengths and weaknesses. This is a great kind of first steps to figuring out what yours are going to be. Kind of deep, it's a little early on for some of that, but these are things to think about. So as you're doing your look at correspondences in kind of traditional meanings, I recommend you start making your own basic table of correspondences. Just as a shorthand and a learning tool. Find at least 3 sources. I really, really recommend at least one of them being an actual physical book. The internet is a beautiful thing, but it's also filled with lies. Not that books can't also be filled with lies, but at least something by a reputable publisher is likely to have at least been vetted by an editor to not be complete nonsense. Your Scott Cunningham, great starter source. Basic correspondences, things you're going to find in like the Encyclopedia of 5,000 Spells. Basic correspondences are going to be in there. They're going to be kind of the standard things that folks agree on. So find at least 3 different sources so you can make sure that you've got some agreement on things. Look at the basic colors. Look at the elements and their directions. Look at like 5 different herbs. These don't have to be, your Dittany of Crete and wormwood and fancy things. It can literally be the things you've got in your kitchen right now. I actually prefer you look at the things that are in your spice rack. Your cinnamon, your salt, your bay leaves, your rosemary, coriander, cumin. Look at the stuff you've got. Look at stones. Go outside. If you see granite and shale and limestone and marble, no one says it has to be emeralds and moonstones. It can just be rock. That's magical too. Incenses and oils. Pick a couple. This is the one place where you probably do want to go out and buy them from a reputable source. If you live in a relatively metropolitan area, you've got at least one, if not multiple, either pagan shops or occult shops or botanicas, places where you're going to find oils and incenses and blends and things. And I really do recommend, if you're a beginner, buy your first couple. See what they're supposed to look like and feel like. If at all possible, if you can find one of those wonderful, beautiful resources that is a small shop where they actually make things in-house, talk to them. Ask them about how they make it. Hold in your hand like a commercial, like a Lucky Mojo, mass-produced oil versus something that is made by a practitioner in your area. You will notice a difference. Now, that's not to say the Lucky Mojo oil is bad. It's not. It's just a little bit of a different product than something that is made in your area by someone who knows what they're doing and is tuned to the energies of your area. That can make a much stronger product. And in a few lessons, I'm going to teach you how to make your own. Because that, of course, is the best thing you can do is making your own, always. Unless you're bad at a particular crafting technique. That's okay, too. You don't necessarily have to be good at these things. You know, make your own basic table of correspondences so you can start looking at spell components, essentially, and getting familiar with what different things mean when they are used in spell work. And as you're doing this, keep an eye out for conflicts. Did you find 5 different herbs that all mean the same thing? Does one source say that you can only use garlic for banishing demons, and another say you can only use it for enhancing love spells? That's a conundrum. If you find some of those wildly conflicting correspondences, I encourage you to comment. Tell me about it. I totally want to know this stuff because, gosh, it's fascinating the way people think about correspondences. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about ways of personalizing correspondences, and that's where the rubber really is going to start hitting the road. So I hope to see you all very soon in the next lesson. Bye.